The town did not change. That is the first error most records make. They look for a moment, a date, a construction phase, a ribbon cutting or a breach. They point to the Institute and say, "There." But Ravenwood did not become strange when the Institute arrived. It was already behaving in ways that resisted explanation, already correcting itself without instruction, already learning which questions not to ask. The Institute did not transform the town. It recognized it. Selection requires suitability. Suitability requires consistency. Ravenwood had that long before anyone put it on a map worth revisiting. This archive contains reconstructed municipal notes, personal recollections, utility records, and regional observations recorded prior to the establishment of the Black Veil Institute. Some records are incomplete. Some accounts contradict each other. Several entries appear to have been revised multiple times without notation. All material has been preserved exactly as it originally appeared, including administrative corrections that were later deemed unnecessary. No attempt has been made to reconcile discrepancies. There is a common misconception that Ravenwood became strange after the Institute was built. This belief persists because it is convenient. The Institute provides a date, a structure, a point of blame. A building can be photographed, a perimeter can be drawn, a gate can be closed. A town is harder to accuse. Before official interest, before sealed files and restricted access, Ravenwood already exhibited irregularities that residents learned to live around rather than confront. They did not call these events supernatural. They did not record them as incidents. They called them quirks. They called them weather. They called them wiring. They called them old town problems. They called them anything that allowed daily life to continue without interruption. Ravenwood was founded just after the First World War. The land was advertised as workable, affordable, quiet. Early settlers arrived with tools, families, and expectations shaped by necessity rather than optimism. The forest was dense, the soil uneven, and the boundaries between parcels difficult to maintain. Initial survey maps show irregularities that were never fully explained. Distances measured on foot did not align with distances recorded on paper. Streets appear longer in municipal drawings than they do when walked. Property lines shift between revisions by small but persistent margins. These discrepancies were addressed administratively. Measurements were corrected, figures rounded, margins adjusted. No follow-up inspections were ordered. No one returned to the fields to check again. The land was declared compliant and construction continued. From its earliest records, Ravenwood demonstrated a tendency toward quiet non-compliance with expectation, not dramatic, not defiant, persistent. Within the first decade of settlement, residents began noticing recurring environmental features. Fog arrived earlier than surrounding towns and lingered longer after sunrise. Weather reports described clear conditions regionally while Ravenwood remained obscured. The fog did not move uniformly. Some streets disappeared completely while adjacent blocks remained visible. Drivers reported difficulty judging distance, though no increase in accidents was recorded. Street lamps failed in clusters rather than individually. Maintenance crews replaced bulbs and wiring, only to find the same lamps failing again weeks later. Failures did not follow logical electrical distribution patterns. Power fluctuations occurred without correlation to weather or load. Lights dimmed briefly and returned. Clocks reset themselves. Appliances resumed operation without damage. Local electricians cited outdated infrastructure. Utility companies found no consistent faults. Service reports repeat the same conclusions over multiple decades. System within acceptable parameters. No issue detected. Monitor for recurrence. Recurrence was constant. It was simply not treated as urgent. Homes adapted before people acknowledged why. Curtains were drawn earlier than necessary. Porch lights stayed on even when no one was expected. Furniture was rearranged repeatedly until rooms felt stable. Beds were positioned away from corners. Residents offered practical explanations when asked. Drafts, glare, better sleep. These adjustments spread gradually. There was no moment when everyone began doing them at once. They appeared in one house, then another, until they were simply how homes were arranged in Ravenwood. Mirrors became a minor but persistent complaint. Households replaced them repeatedly, citing distortion, warping, or discomfort without visible damage. Glass remained intact. Frames were unbroken. Reflections appeared normal at first glance. Discomfort emerged only after prolonged observation. Residents described difficulty holding their gaze, a sense that reflections lagged slightly behind movement, a feeling that rooms appeared deeper inside mirrors than they were in reality. No one reported seeing anything overtly unusual. They reported unease. One general store stopped selling full-length mirrors altogether after repeated returns and complaints. The owner cited superstition. No one argued. The mirrors were removed from inventory and business continued uninterrupted. This became a pattern. Remove the object. Do not investigate the cause. Resume normal operations. Ravenwood schools were described as old even when they were new. The buildings were functional. The paint was fresh. The windows were intact. And yet teachers used the same phrasing across generations. This place feels older than it should. Classrooms felt longer at night. Hallways echoed improperly. Bells rang too early or too late without mechanical cause. Maintenance checks found no faults. Students occasionally became disoriented during routine drills. They exited classrooms into corridors they did not recognize, followed instructions precisely, and still arrived somewhere unexpected before eventually returning to familiar spaces. Teachers attributed this to stress. Children were told to pay better attention. No further action was taken. Parents noticed smaller inconsistencies, walking routes that felt different in winter than in fall, shortcuts that took longer when retraced, corners where conversations trailed off and restarted elsewhere. Adults did not connect these observations. They treated them the way people treat headaches: common, annoying, not worth the effort of asking why. The forest surrounding Ravenwood predates the town. It resisted development repeatedly. Logging attempts stalled without clear cause. Equipment failed. Crews reported becoming lost within sight of cleared paths. Bird populations avoided certain sections entirely. Local folklore warned children not to wander past marked trees. No one could later agree who marked them or when. Some remembered paint. Others remembered nails. Others insisted there had never been marks at all. Several residents reported hearing their names spoken from the tree line during periods of heavy fog. Not shouted, not urgent. Spoken calmly, as if by someone standing just out of view. No disappearances were officially linked to the woods during early decades. Unofficially, people avoided them anyway. They did not describe fear. They described inconvenience, density, a lack of reason to go further in. Decades before the Institute's construction, the ground behind the woods collapsed without warning. No seismic activity was recorded. The sinkhole formed cleanly, as if the earth had opened rather than broken. Measurements taken at the time were inconsistent. Depth varied depending on angle and distance. Tape measures did not agree. Dropped objects could not be timed reliably. Some residents reported a faint warmth rising from the opening at night. Not heat, not steam, warmth. The site was fenced off. The fence required frequent repair. Boards split, posts loosened, locks rusted prematurely. Despite this, the sinkhole was not treated as a threat. It was treated as a nuisance, something to work around. Ravenwood did not panic. That is important. There were no mass meetings, no emergency bulletins, no coordinated warnings. Instead, the town adapted. People learned which streets to avoid at night, which houses always felt colder, which rooms never felt empty even when vacant. They stopped asking questions that never produced answers. This behavior predates any government presence. The town did not need instruction on how to normalize discomfort. It had already been learned. Outside observers often misunderstood Ravenwood. Quiet was mistaken for safe. Ravenwood was quiet because it learned that loud reactions changed nothing. Irregularities did not escalate rapidly. They repeated. They echoed. They formed patterns. That made them predictable. Stable does not mean harmless. It means consistent. After its first decades, Ravenwood settled into patterns that felt ordinary to those living within them and indistinct to anyone passing through. Records from the 1930s and 40s show a town that functioned efficiently, if narrowly. Budgets balanced. Schools remained open. Roads were repaired often enough to remain usable. What the records do not show is confusion. Confusion rarely survives paperwork. County offices maintained Ravenwood's files without difficulty. That, in itself, was unusual. Documents arrived complete. Forms were filled out correctly the first time. Signatures matched. Dates aligned. When discrepancies appeared, they corrected themselves before formal review. A property deed filed under one lot number would later appear under another, with no record of amendment. The corrected version always appeared cleaner. The older copy could not be located. Clerks described this as efficiency. They did not describe it as a loss. Maintenance logs from this period repeat phrasing across years. Adjusted lighting, checked wiring, replaced fixtures. The same street lamps appear repeatedly, the same school wings, the same intersections near the woods. Crews reported completing the work. The work was never permanent. No escalation followed. The absence of escalation was treated as proof that no deeper issue existed. Residents developed explanations that required no verification. If something repeated, it was age. If something shifted, it was weather. If something felt wrong, it was fatigue. These explanations circulated freely. They were not challenged because they did not demand action. Ravenwood did not deny its irregularities. It domesticated them. School records from this era show uninterrupted operation. Attendance remained consistent. Graduation rates held steady. Staff turnover was low. Marginal notes appear in older ledgers. Bell late again. Students confused during drill. Wing feels longer at end of day. These notes do not continue beyond the margins. They are never elevated to formal concern. Each year, the next teacher inherits the building and the silence. Children adjusted faster than adults. They learned which stairwells to avoid, which classrooms felt louder than they should, which doors were best not opened during free periods. They did not frame this knowledge as fear. They framed it as preference. Teachers described these children as intuitive, calm, well-behaved. No one asked what they were responding to. Households developed subtle routines. Lights were turned off in certain rooms earlier than others. Basements were used less, often. Attics remained untouched. Families slept closer together during storms, even mild ones. Asked why, residents offered practical reasons: cold air, noise, drafts. These explanations were accepted without scrutiny. Businesses adjusted inventory based on demand that could not be explained through sales data alone. The hardware store stocked fewer mirrors. The pharmacy reduced certain lighting fixtures. The diner removed a booth that customers avoided without complaint. No one requested these changes. They simply stopped using certain items. Commerce responded. Broadcast logs from the local radio station show minor but persistent irregularities. Segments begin early or end late. Weather updates repeat unchanged despite visible differences outside. Music occasionally restarts mid-track. Technicians noted signal drift. No repairs improved it. Listeners adapted by lowering the volume or switching stations briefly, then returning. The station remained trusted. That mattered more than precision. Weather became a reliable explanation for everything. Fog obscured delays. Storms explained power issues. Cold nights justified discomfort. When weather failed to align with experience, experience yielded. Ravenwood learned to accept mismatch without resolution. Logging permits were issued intermittently. They expired unused. Crews reported equipment malfunction and disorientation. Paths cleared one day felt closed the next. Markers vanished. No injuries were recorded. The absence of injury became the focus. The woods were labelled impractical, not dangerous. Memory in Ravenwood functioned collectively rather than individually. If one person forgot, another remembered enough to continue. If several disagreed, the version that allowed progress prevailed. This prevented conflict. It also prevented inquiry. Neighbouring towns viewed Ravenwood as quiet and unremarkable. No one visited for long. No one stayed without reason. Those who passed through described it as forgettable. This reputation persisted. It protected the town from attention. Long before formal interest, external agencies requested environmental summaries. These requests were routine and non-specific. Ravenwood's responses were prompt and clean. Irregularities were noted as resolved. Patterns were described as seasonal. Stability was emphasized. The summaries were accurate. They simply omitted context. Ravenwood continued. It did not escalate. It did not rupture. It did not demand explanation. And because it remained predictable, it remained acceptable. Ravenwood entered the post-war decades without notable disruption. There were no population spikes, no sudden declines, no economic booms large enough to draw attention. What changed instead was definition. Records became cleaner. Language became more precise. Ambiguity was reduced on paper even as it increased in practice. This balance was maintained carefully. Sometime in the late 1940s, municipal documents began favoring neutral phrasing. Problems became variances. Delays became adjustments. Unclear outcomes became pending alignment. This language did not originate in Ravenwood. It arrived already formed and fit easily into local use. Officials adopted it because it reduced follow-up. Once a matter was categorized as aligned, no further action was required. Ravenwood's defining feature was not anomaly. It was restraint. Events repeated without amplification. Irregularities remained localized. No single incident demanded emergency response. This absence of escalation prevented investigation. State and county agencies prioritized disruption. Ravenwood produced none. The town functioned. That was enough. Road repairs followed unusual patterns. Fresh asphalt near the woods lasted longer than newer material elsewhere. Painted lines remained crisp through winters that eroded everything else. Repairs conducted repeatedly along the same routes produced identical results. Crews documented completion and moved on. No one asked why the same repairs were always required. Routine absorbed discomfort. Residents learned which lights flickered and ignored them, which intersections felt wrong at night and avoided them. Routines did not eliminate irregularity. They made it livable. This adaptability became generational. Children inherited it without instruction. Teachers stayed longer in Ravenwood than in neighboring districts. Those who left did so quietly. Exit interviews cite family reasons, better opportunities, commute considerations. No one cited the building. Privately, several former staff described difficulty articulating discomfort. It wasn't bad. It just felt off. I couldn't explain it. None pursued formal complaint. Counseling records from this period show an increase in vague reports. Students described feeling watched without seeing anyone, hearing sounds without source, becoming disoriented briefly during familiar routines. Counselors documented symptoms and recommended rest, structure, and consistency. The recommendations were effective. Symptoms subsided. This was interpreted as success. Broadcast irregularities increased in frequency but not severity. Moments of silence appeared between segments. Songs restarted unexpectedly. Weather reports contradicted visible conditions. Listeners adapted. Trust remained intact. The station's reliability was measured by familiarity, not accuracy. The forest became less a place and more a limit. Children played near it but did not enter deeply. Hunters adjusted routes without discussion. Paths were abandoned without explanation. No signage enforced this. The boundary was felt rather than marked. The sinkhole remained fenced and unremarked upon. Maintenance logs show frequent repairs, boards replaced, locks changed, posts reset. Measurements were taken intermittently. Results did not align. Depth readings varied depending on observer and method. No report included a definitive figure. Eventually, measurements ceased. The sinkhole was declared stable. By the early 1960s, Ravenwood appeared in internal summaries produced by external agencies. These summaries were brief. They noted environmental inconsistency, infrastructural repetition, and behavioral adaptation. They emphasized predictability. No action was recommended. Ravenwood did not generate headlines. It did not require funding. It did not require evacuation. It did not require explanation. It absorbed irregularity and continued functioning. This quality was noted. Requests for additional data increased subtly. Environmental samples, population trends, utility reliability. Ravenwood complied fully. Responses were prompt and thorough. Nothing in the data suggested urgency. Everything suggested suitability. No one asked why the town adapted so easily. No one asked why irregularities did not spread. No one asked why residents learned to ignore discomfort rather than investigate it. The absence of these questions was not accidental. They did not feel necessary. Ravenwood continued as it always had, predictable, contained, quietly inconsistent. And because it did not draw attention, attention arrived anyway. Ravenwood continued as it always had, predictable, contained, quietly inconsistent, and because it did not draw attention, attention arrived anyway. The earliest formal inquiries did not announce themselves. They arrived as paperwork, requests for clarification, requests for confirmation, requests for data that had already been supplied. County clerks noted the repetition and complied without comment. The requests were routine in appearance, stamped correctly, signed neatly, and returned promptly. No urgency was expressed, no purpose was stated. The tone suggested continuation, not initiation. Visitors began appearing intermittently. They did not identify themselves as inspectors. They did not carry visible authority. They asked polite questions and took careful notes. They visited the same locations repeatedly: the school perimeter, the road near the woods, the fenced sinkhole. They never stayed long. Residents recalled seeing unfamiliar cars parked briefly and then gone, leaving no disruption behind. No one asked who they were. They did not ask to be known. Survey stakes appeared near the tree line. Bright paint, metal markers, ribbon tied loosely to branches. They shifted positions over time. Markers moved a few feet between weeks. Some vanished. Others appeared deeper in. Hunters reported paths closing without explanation. Trails that had existed for decades ended abruptly against nothing visible. No fences were erected. The boundary was implied. Town forms began arriving pre-filled, names correct, dates accurate, decisions already categorized. Clerks assumed this was a new efficiency initiative. When asked where the templates originated, no one had an answer. The forms worked. That was sufficient. Council meetings continued. Attendance remained consistent. Votes passed. Minutes were recorded. Residents remembered being present. They remembered the chairs, the room, the sound of papers moving. They did not remember what was decided. When questioned later, several described the same sensation, having agreed to something important without recalling what it was. They laughed when they said this. At first, the wording changed before the policy did. Routine became procedure. Repair became adjustment. Irregular became expected variance. These terms appeared in memos without explanation. No one objected. The language felt official. The road nearest the woods was repaved. It became smoother than any other road in town. Potholes did not form. Painted lines remained crisp through winters that degraded everything else. Signage appeared and disappeared. Residents learned not to drive that way unless necessary. No rule was issued. Compliance was instinctive. Teachers noticed changes that were difficult to quantify. Certain hallways felt longer at the end of the day. Some classrooms were harder to quiet, no matter how seating was arranged. Clocks in different wings disagreed by minutes. Maintenance blamed wiring. Administration blamed student energy. The year continued. Children adapted without explanation. They avoided specific stairwells. They hesitated at certain doors. They moved through the building with quiet efficiency. Asked why, they shrugged. It's easier. It's better this way. Adults accepted this as maturity. Broadcasts shifted subtly. Late-night programming ended earlier. Recorded segments replayed more often than requested. Moments of silence stretched between tracks. Listeners described hearing something beneath the sound. Not voices, not messages, presence. Technicians found nothing wrong. Equipment was old. Signals drifted. That explanation satisfied everyone. The sinkhole fence was replaced with a heavier barrier. Locks were upgraded. Warning signs appeared briefly, then disappeared. Measurements were no longer taken. The site was marked stable. No one remembered who made that determination. Calm became the metric. As long as nothing escalated, nothing required action. Minor disturbances that resolved quietly were logged as successful. Anything that drew attention was adjusted until it did not. This approach worked. Ravenwood remained functional. Residents learned where not to go. Not through warnings, not through fences, through feeling. Roads near the woods felt watched. Drivers turned around without recalling the decision. Children stopped biking past certain intersections and took longer routes that felt easier. No one instructed them to do so. Everyone complied. By the time larger equipment appeared near the forest, Ravenwood had already adjusted. The town had learned to accept change without understanding it, to trust paperwork more than memory, to treat alignment as safety. Nothing about the preparations felt sudden. That was the point. Ravenwood did not mark the moment interest became intent. It did not need to. It had already made itself ready. The transition from interest to presence did not occur abruptly. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no stated purpose. There was only increased activity that arrived already normalized. Machinery appeared near the woods before most residents noticed it. Trucks arrived early and left before dusk. They carried no visible logos. License plates varied by state and were not remembered consistently. The equipment was modern and well maintained. It did not idle long. It did not break down. It did not require local assistance. Residents assumed road work. Road work was common. Tree clearing progressed quietly. No chainsaws at night, no burning, no debris piles left visible. Sections of forest simply thinned. What was removed did not feel missing. Paths did not appear suddenly open. Sightlines remained short. The woods retained their shape. A temporary access road was cut and repaved repeatedly. It changed alignment more than once. Residents who drove it reported arriving sooner than expected. Those who attempted to retrace the route described difficulty locating the entrance again. The road was not marked. No maps were updated. Town offices received new documents, zoning confirmations, environmental acknowledgements, utility coordination notices. Each document arrived complete. Signatures were present. Dates aligned. Required approvals appeared already stamped. No hearings were scheduled. No objections were recorded. The paperwork implied that the process had already occurred. Several long-term residents later described the same sensation. Not coercion, not confusion, agreement, as if they had consented to something during a conversation they could not fully recall. The feeling carried no urgency. It did not inspire resistance. It simply settled. Lights began staying on later in specific school wings. Custodial staff noted unlocked classrooms after securing them. Chairs were rearranged. Chalkboards wiped clean. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was missing. Asked about the activity, administrators referenced authorized use. No schedules were shared. Job postings appeared briefly. Clerical assistance, maintenance support, custodial shifts. They were removed within days. Those hired left early and returned tired but intact. When asked what they did, they offered neutral answers. Paperwork, cleaning, routine tasks. No one pressed further. The road closest to the construction site was resurfaced again. It became smoother than the rest of town. Painted, lines remained crisp. Drainage improved. Snow melted there first in winter. Drivers slowed without being instructed. No signage enforced it. Night felt different. Not darker, not louder, more deliberate. Street lamps near the woods stayed on longer. Insects gathered around certain lights and ignored others entirely. People began locking doors at night without recalling when the habit began. The diner remained open. It simply changed. Conversations ended sooner. Coffee cooled untouched. Patrons stared at reflections in windows rather than at one another. The jukebox was used less often. When it played, it seemed louder than before. No one adjusted the volume. Silences on the radio increased. Not static, not interference. Silence. A song would end and nothing followed for several seconds. Listeners waited without reaching for the dial. Then programming resumed as if uninterrupted. Technicians logged no faults. The forest was avoided after dusk. Animals stopped, crossing roads near the construction area. Headlights illuminated empty stretches where deer had once been common. Wind moved unevenly through the trees. No reports were filed. New faces appeared briefly in town. They stayed one night. They spoke little. They paid in cash. They did not ask for directions. By morning, they were gone. Residents began describing dreams they struggled to explain. Not nightmares, not visions. A sense of having been awake somewhere else. People woke feeling as though they had missed something important. No one compared details. Despite everything, Ravenwood functioned. School buses ran on time. Stores opened and closed as scheduled. Birthdays were celebrated. Funerals were attended. The town did not feel threatened. It felt managed. A name appeared on paperwork. Black Veil Institute. The words felt heavy when spoken aloud. People avoided repeating them. Eventually, they shortened it. The place near the woods. That was easier. Ravenwood did not mark the day construction became permanence. It accepted the presence as it accepted everything else. Quietly, completely. By the time the Institute's presence was acknowledged as permanent, Ravenwood had already adjusted its expectations. What followed was not disruption. It was refinement. The first measurable change was linguistic. Internal documents adopted new phrasing without announcement. Routine became procedure. Maintenance became containment. Irregular became expected variance. The language appeared simultaneously across departments. School memos, utility reports, municipal notices. No one recalled being trained to use it. The terms worked. They reduced follow-up questions. Containment was not introduced as a response. It was framed as prevention. Schedules were adjusted to reduce interference. Building access was modified to limit exposure. Traffic patterns were altered to maintain stability. These phrases were repeated across documents without definition. No one asked what required containing. A brief advisory circulated among town staff. Do not rely on recollection. Confirm with documentation. Assume discontinuity. Meetings ended with written summaries distributed immediately, as if spoken words could not be trusted to persist. People began writing things down more often. They also began forgetting where they had written them. Doors that had never been locked were locked. Storage rooms, maintenance closets, unused classrooms. Keys were issued, then reissued. Some no longer worked. Others opened doors no one remembered assigning them to. Signs appeared briefly and disappeared. The doors remained closed. School schedules tightened. Outdoor activities ended earlier. Assemblies shortened. Unstructured time decreased. Permission slips changed wording. Parents signed without reading closely. The language was dense and reassuring. Safety updates. Liability adjustments. No objections were raised. Children stopped explaining what they noticed. They still noticed. They learned which questions ended conversations early. Teachers reported fewer disruptions. Parents reported calmer evenings. Counselors noted improved compliance. Everyone described this as progress. Night routines narrowed further. Families stayed in the same rooms together. Televisions played quietly, not for entertainment, but for sound. Bedrooms felt farther apart than before. Parents checked on children more often, then less often, then only once. Sleep arrived unevenly. Clocks stopped agreeing. Watches ran slow, then corrected themselves days later. Classroom clocks differed by minutes. Schedules overlapped and still worked. No one tracked discrepancies long enough to establish a pattern. Maintenance crews worked later hours. Trucks idled with engines running. Workers moved deliberately and spoke little. Asked what they were fixing, they answered vaguely. Calibration, alignment, routine checks. No reports followed. People avoided mirrors without realizing it. They glanced away quickly. They covered them during storms. They preferred dimmer rooms. Windows reflected too much at night. Porch lights stayed on, not to see outside, but to reduce reflection. No one admitted discomfort. Residents began using the word differently, not as a date, as a feeling. Before things shifted, before it got like this, before the road changed. Asked to clarify, they struggled. The timeline felt soft. The local paper printed fewer specifics, not fewer pages, fewer details. Events were mentioned without names. Locations were described broadly. Editorials avoided commentary. Nothing was censored. It simply wasn't written. Ravenwood adjusted, not consciously, not all at once. Life continued inside narrower paths. Curiosity dulled. Movement followed invisible lines. People slept, woke, worked, and returned home. They told themselves this was normal. Ravenwood did not question the changes. It had already learned that questions created friction, and friction was now categorized as a risk. The next phase did not arrive with instruction. It arrived with expectation. By the time anyone noticed a difference, the difference had already been accounted for. The first internal incident reports were brief. They did not describe accidents. They did not describe events. They described outcomes. A hallway light remained red longer than expected, then returned to normal. A door locked itself from the inside, then opened without damage. A student experienced confusion, then resumed baseline behavior. The word successful appeared frequently. No definition was attached. Signatures on these reports did not match known officials. Titles were long and specific. Departments changed names between documents. Contact information was present but never used. No one questioned authority that arrived fully formatted. Paperwork moved forward. Certain school wings remained lit late into the night. Custodial staff reported rooms unlocked after securing them. Chairs were rearranged. Chalkboards wiped clean. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. Administrators referenced authorized use. No schedules were shared. Some students were asked to stay late. Not detained. Not disciplined. Escorted politely and returned before buses departed. Parents were not notified. Asked later, the children struggled to explain. I helped. I talked. I don't remember. Teachers stopped asking follow-up questions. Success was measured by calm, no panic, no disruption, no deviation lasting longer than expected. Anything that resolved quietly was logged as effective. Anything that drew attention was adjusted until it did not. Residents reported moments they could not account for. An afternoon that felt skipped. Conversation that ended without memory of how. A walk that arrived too quickly. They laughed and blamed fatigue. Everyone was tired. Incident reports did not leave the system. They were not shared with county offices. They were not archived publicly. They were not summarized. There was no requirement to explain outcomes labeled stable. Ravenwood adjusted again. People expected interruptions. They expected corrections. They expected to forget small things. This expectation reduced stress. Reports reflected improvement. Residents described a sensation they struggled to articulate. Not control, not safety. Being handled gently, as if something larger was managing details they no longer needed to. Many found this comforting. Ravenwood accepted the results. The incidents did not spread. The town remained intact, and because it remained intact, the methods were allowed to continue. What followed was not escalation. It was management. The distinction mattered to those recording it. Not everything resolved on schedule. There were brief moments when calm thinned. A hallway light stayed red longer than expected. A door refused to respond to any key and would not open from either side. A student cried for hours without knowing why and could not be soothed. Each instance ended. That was the detail that mattered. Responses arrived without urgency. They did not run. They did not raise voices. They arrived with clipboards, neutral expressions, and instructions delivered once. Rooms were cleared quietly. Students were guided elsewhere. Teachers were told schedules had shifted. No one was sent home early. Reports describing these moments used careful phrasing. Localized disruption. Temporary displacement. Resolved without secondary effects. No emotional descriptors appeared. Fear was not documented. One classroom near the back of the school closed indefinitely. No announcement followed. Notice appeared briefly, then disappeared. The door remained locked. Teachers stopped assigning seats nearby. Students avoided the hallway instinctively. The room vanished from printed maps the following year. No one asked where it went. Containment was no longer an action. It became a condition. Lights adjusted themselves. Bells rang earlier or later. Heating systems shifted room by room. People adapted without pausing. Town stories lost sequence. Events were remembered without causes. Outcomes were recalled without beginnings. When residents compared memories, discrepancies were gentle and easily dismissed. No one insisted. Fear requires clarity. Ravenwood never received enough of it. Moments ended before escalation. Explanations arrived before questions formed. Unsettlement passed without becoming anything else. Streetlights dimmed later into the night. Suggested curfews circulated without enforcement. Windows stayed dark. Crime statistics remained unchanged. The adjustments were justified. Objects disappeared from public spaces. Bulletin boards, unused lockers, extra mirrors. No one recalled their removal. They simply were not there anymore. Ravenwood learned to continue without resolution. Things ended without explanation. That was enough. The town kept moving. Ravenwood remained intact. It did not react loudly enough to be corrected. It did not resist strongly enough to be restrained. It adapted. After management became atmosphere, Ravenwood lost its sense of transition. There was no longer a clear before and after. There was only now. Residents found it difficult to compare current conditions to earlier ones. Questions like better or worse stopped making sense. People could describe how things were, but not how they had changed. When pressed, they paused longer than expected. Memories felt accurate but incomplete, like copies made from older copies. No one trusted them enough to argue. Mornings stopped feeling like beginnings. People woke already alert, as if sleep had been a pause rather than a reset. Kitchens filled with light too quickly. Radios came on mid-sentence. Children dressed without reminders. Shoes waited by doors. Backpacks rested where they always had. Parents watched them leave with a sense of relief they could not explain. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt new. School days lost their markers. Assemblies shortened. Announcements thinned. Holidays felt closer together. Teachers noticed students adapting without effort. Lessons flowed smoothly. Questions were rare. Silence was mistaken for focus. Ravenwood felt flatter, not geographically, conceptually. Places blended together. Routes felt interchangeable. Direction mattered less than arrival. People stopped giving detailed directions. Just keep going. You'll know when you're there. They were always right. Homes reoriented themselves. Families spent more time in shared spaces. Doors stayed open. Lights were left on in rooms that felt necessary and off everywhere else. Basements were avoided without discussion. Attics were rarely entered. Furniture was rearranged often, then left untouched for long stretches. Some layouts lasted. Town hall meetings continued. Attendance declined slowly. Agendas shortened. Votes passed without debate. Discussion ended early. No one disagreed because no one felt the need to. Sentences shortened. Descriptions grew vague. Specifics felt unnecessary. People understood one another without detail. This efficiency was praised. Misunderstandings became rare. A low-level anticipation settled over the town. Not dread, not excitement, expectation, as if something was pending and always had been. No one speculated. Dreams became harder to describe, not because they were disturbing, because they lacked form. People woke knowing they had dreamed, but not what about. This became normal. Eventually, before stopped referring to a time. It referred to a state, a sense of looseness, of options. Ravenwood no longer existed there. By the time anyone noticed that normal had vanished, there was nothing left to compare it to. The town functioned. That was enough. By the time the Institute officially acknowledged its role in Ravenwood, there was very little left to acknowledge. The town was already aligned. Compatibility was never announced. It was observed. Systems that once required adjustment now settled immediately. Schedules aligned without revision. Infrastructure accepted changes without resistance. What had previously pushed back no longer did. Ravenwood fit the shape that had been prepared for it. No one recorded the moment this occurred. There was no threshold. Daily routines became exact. Wake, move, return. Interruptions were rare. When they occurred, they corrected themselves quietly. Missed steps folded into the next action without consequence. People described this as efficiency. They reported feeling less tired. Children adapted completely. They navigated hallways without hesitation. They avoided specific doors instinctively. They followed instructions that were never spoken aloud. Teachers praised their focus. Parents praised their calm. No one asked what the children understood that adults did not. Questions stopped forming. Not because answers had been found, because curiosity no longer felt useful. Updates were accepted without context. Changes arrived already normalized. The town ran smoothly. The woods no longer felt adjacent. They felt incorporated. Lights near the tree line pulsed faintly at night, steady enough not to draw attention. Access paths remained clear but unused. Animals stayed away. No one mentioned it. The Institute became background noise. Not hidden, not remarkable. It was simply there, like weather or gravity. People oriented their lives around it without acknowledging the act. Memories persisted without weight. Events were recalled without emotion. Earlier versions of the town felt theoretical. People spoke about the past, the way they spoke about places they had never visited. There was no grief. The last locally authored notes are brief, short sentences, minimal detail, clean formatting. They describe a town operating within expected parameters. No concerns noted. At some point, documentation shifts ownership. Town phrasing gives way to institutional language. Headers change. Signatures change. The transition is seamless. No overlap is recorded. This archive does not document the beginning of the Institute. It documents the end of something else, a version of Ravenwood that required explanation. By the time the Institute officially opened, Ravenwood was already prepared. It had learned how to accept, how to adjust, how to forget without distress. Nothing was taken suddenly. Everything was given up gradually.